Without any further ado, I call upon Phil to come forward and deliver his most interesting part.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is after midday. Thank you very much for having me. I'm a little overwhelmed. I didn't think you'd get so many here on a Wednesday at lunchtime. Had to pay to come. I thought you paid me to come. But I'm very disappointed to hear there are no sandwiches. Last time we were here, Dean, when we spoke on Bomber Command, you provided lunch for us. So, complaints department is up. Oh, the COVID, blame COVID for everything. Look, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a little bit sort of embarrassed because I'm sure many of you would know perhaps a lot more about the O'Reilly and the Stinson incident. What I have done is I'm a wannabe pilot. And I say that very tongue-in-cheek because I'm not really a pilot. I spent a bit of time flying when I was about 17 or 18, and I found that the flying lessons were very expensive. And it came down to a very simple question: would I go out with women or would I continue flying? Guess what happened? The women won. And I don't really regret it. But because I am making some assumptions about flying and pilots, I have spent about 120 hours in, well, mostly a Tiger Moth, actually, because a friend of mine had a Tiger. Anyone flown a Tiger Moth? Yeah, marvellous aircraft. I saw on the news the other day they're about to ground them all because they're too old. They're getting old and fatigued. So. And if you know a Tiger Moth, if you ever hear one go across, they have an absolutely distinctive engine noise. But leading into it, over on my left-hand side is a good friend, Darryl Holden. Put your hand up, Darryl. He is a real pilot. You know, he knows what he's talking about, not me. So I'm going to, perhaps right at the end of it, ask him a little bit about some of the assumptions I made about what actually happened in the crash. Darryl's an ex-RAAF pilot, choppers and other aircraft, and he has been recently giving some very interesting talks on Bomber Command, which may be something you'd be interested in. Not necessarily a strong Queensland connection, although Bennett came, who was the Pathfinder's founder, or came from Toowoomba. Very interesting talk. My interest is my dad was a World War II bomber pilot in the UK, so flying has been in my blood, and that's hence part of my interest in the Stinson. I have been to O'Reilly's, but we'll talk about that. Let's get on with it, because what I would like to do is give the background, and I think, I'm just trying to work out how to move the slide projector along. I'm sorry about the people up the back. You may not be able to see the picture that well. I'm just trying to find the best position to stand.
3 seats down the front.
Actually, Darryl, I might get you to see if you'll click that, see if it works. Look, just before we do, that's a painting that was done obviously after the crash, and it's up in the O'Reilly guest house, and that's the colours of it, VH-UHH, and you might know that every aircraft in Australia, even today, that's registered in Australia starts with Victor Hotel, VH. And I was asking a mathematician friend of mine the other day, I was just curious, the mathematicians in the house, anyone who fancies themselves, how many letters combination could you have with 3 letters, 26 letters in the alphabet? And you'll still see them. All the aircraft, all the commercial aircraft have a VH. And I'm wondering, when are they going to run out of letters of the combination? Apparently it's 17,500 something or other. So, but that was one of the Stinsons. There were 4. That is correct in its colours. And there's a few features of the Stinson which I'll come to very soon, which are important to the crash. Now, it occurred on the 19th of February, 1937, which was a Friday afternoon. It left Archer Field at 1 p.m, or 1300 hours, as they like to say in flying and military terms. Okay, let's try the next slide. Well done. Thank you, Darryl. It's an interesting aircraft. Apart from Darryl, I would like to ask anyone if they can see any features of that aircraft which were quite different and revolutionary then, and certainly even today. There's 2 features of it that once I point them out to you, you'll realise, and they do affect the reason, or part of the reason why the aircraft crashed. Anyone offer any suggestions?
Is it the fact that the tail moves and a little...
No, that's standard. Good try.
Wing support.
The wing supports, yes. The struts come down from the top of the fuselage down to the wing. Very unusual design. Normally they come up from the bottom, which aeronautically has some significance. So that was a design feature. There's something else there that is so obvious that you will now notice it every other time when you do.
At the front, right?
Oh, okay. The passenger door is on the right-hand side, on the starboard side. Very few, if any, passenger aircraft have the standard entry to the aircraft on the right-hand side or the starboard side. It's on the port side, on the left-hand side. You look at all commercial airlines, even go to the international airport, you nearly always board the aircraft from the left-hand side. So the Stinson's main entry, which also is important to what happened when the aircraft crashed, is on the left-hand side. A few other features: has 3 engines, radial engines, quite good. It was very much state of the art at the time that they got 4 of them. That's one of the 4, and it came from the US. And the company Stinson made a number of other aircraft, but it was almost the latest technology that was available for passenger aircraft coming out of the US at that time. Thanks, Darryl. If you really are keen, the specifications are there. It has the wingspan and the length, but more importantly is its speed over ground, and I better just double check that. I think it was very fast for its time. It had a surface ceiling of 15,000 feet, which is, about, 8,000 metres, would it, or 6,000 metres? Yeah, not very high, but pretty high for its time. But the speed is the thing I really wanted to pick up on. 165 miles per hour at 5,000 feet. What's that in real terms? About 220, 230 kilometres an hour, which was pretty damn quick for an aircraft at that time. Without any weather problems, it could fly between Brisbane and Sydney in about 4 hours, 3.5 to 4 hours under normal circumstances with normal loading. Anyway, the specifications are there. I should probably at this stage mention to Sophie, who's gone, I think, she asked me if I could download a document, and I do have a document which I didn't bring with me, which has a lot of this material in it. So, and I'm happy, Dean, or Michael, for you to have that. I made a fatal error in that I did put in a bibliography, but I did not reference any of the statements in the document. They are all true. My history, one of my professors, he's a real name dropper, was Manning Clark, and he would not be happy for me not referencing the material. Okay, Darryl, next one, thanks. 2 key documents which are very relevant to the flight. Now, it's going to be a bit hard for you to see that, but over on the left-hand side is the flight register, which was coming out of the Department of Civil Aviation. And you'll see that the pilot is a chap by the name of Boyd. And he flew into Brisbane. You'll see his flight if you look carefully. And there's a bit of discrepancy. This is off the original flight register as to the weather conditions. Some of the other aircraft had flown up from Sydney. Some had flown down from Brisbane. And there was a bit of a dispute on weather conditions. And one of them, the pilot, sort of said it was bad. And a couple of the others said it was okay. Well, it depends really on the pilot's experience and probably where they went. But there, if you look carefully, you'll see the various flights that were in and out of Brisbane on that fateful day. The flight that the Stinson, the one we're talking about, was due to take off and did in fact take off at 1 p.m. And you'll see that Boyd, now there's another fellow here by the name of Shepherd. And I'm really pleased to see that there are some women, ladies, in the audience today, because the real cause of the crash was a woman. Because Bev Shepherd was in love, and he had a hot date. And he had a hot date with a woman, I'll tell you, and that's the reason the plane crashed, or took off anyway, because Bev Shepherd came up. I'm jumping ahead a bit. He was off duty, and one of the other pilots went sick. They rang him and said, could you do a trip up to Brisbane? He decided he would agree to that, but he said, I've got one condition. I've got to be back in Sydney for Friday night because I've got this date with Gene Batten. So you'll see Bev Shepherd there. Normally they didn't have two pilots. Couldn't, pay them. And Boyd was the pilot in charge. He is listed there. He had already flown up and he was flying back to Sydney. He was based in Sydney. On the other side, there's a document which just says, mechanically there was nothing wrong, it was properly fuelled, it was okay for it to take off. So that's the bit of dispute between the pilots as to whether the weather was bad. My reading of it is the weather was bad, certainly over the Lamington Plateau. Right, let's go for the next one. Boyd was an interesting fellow, a very experienced pilot. He had flown at Stinson from Sydney that morning. It took off in difficult weather just after 1300 hours from Lismore. Now, the pilots didn't actually have to file a flight plan, which in today's terms just doesn't happen, or you're not allowed to do that. He said, well, we're going to Sydney. We may or may not go via Lismore, depending on the weather. There were some passengers at Lismore that were hoping to get on the aircraft. But basically, the route was left up to the pilot. He could choose whether... Now, there were a couple of routes, and I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I'm trying to make it... he could go inland, he could go out west, but then there'd be a bit of a fuel problem. He may have to refuel. And there weren't very many airstrips that he could land on, although the Stinson could land on pretty well anything. Or he could go down the coastal route, or he could go down directly to Lismore, which those of you who know the geography between here and Lismore is over the ranges. And that's the route that he took off on, and that's the route that we know that he attempted to fly. He was last seen, I assume some people, including myself, have walked in the areas there. Have you done some of the tracks? Mount Widgie is one of the key mountains there. That was where O'Reilly, well, one of the neighbours, wasn't O'Reilly, actually that's where they last saw the aircraft flying south at Mount Widgie. And we'll come back to that about O'Reilly in a minute. It crashed at about 13:39 hours, or just a bit after 1:30. How do we know that? About 3 months after the crash, someone found a watch in the debris some distance away, and the watch had stopped at that time, and they returned the watch. I think I've got a photograph of that. So we're pretty certain that there was about a 30-plus minute flight. Once he took off right on time, there was a lot of pressure for them to keep to schedule because the airlines were very competitive and people were paying big money to fly. And as a result, the airlines were really keen to say, right, if you're saying you're going to take off at 1300 or 1 o'clock, then that's when you take off. So they did take off. I'll come back to the takeoff in a moment. A little bit of background, Rex Boyden had done that route over 500 times. So he was very familiar with the terrain. He'd flown it in all sorts of conditions, sun, day, they didn't do very much night flying, but he knew the area. So he was comfortable with what he was doing. He had crashed once before, and I'll show you a photograph of that shortly, in New Guinea in 1930. There were 2 crew on board and 5 passengers. Now, there were 2 crew on board because, as I said, Bev Shepherd wanted to go back for his date. They wouldn't normally have 2 pilots. Now, anyone got it, apart from Darryl, anyone done any flying or knows what goes on? Where does the pilot in charge normally sit?
Left-hand.
Left-hand side. So who was in the left-hand side seat? Boyden. Who was in the right-hand side? Shepherd. He was getting a free lift back. Sometimes they put a passenger in there if they had a full complement, but generally, and still today, I think in any sort of aircraft, military and civil, the chief pilot, the pilot in charge, is in the left. The hangers-on, the others, are on the left or right-hand side or the back or wherever else. There were a number of disputes at the time out at Archerfield, and I'll come to those. The weather was reported to be inconclusive. Now, you couldn't get on your phone and go onto BOM or weather and say, look, there's a storm coming through here. Probably there's a few coming through this afternoon, I think. But it was just very uncertain. They didn't really have a good clue on what the weather was. Next one, but just before we, no, that's all right. Just before we go, A significant feature is obviously the mountain range, which goes through here. So he's flying directly over, pretty clear flying to the range, pretty clear flying once you get over the range down to Lismore. But that really stands out. And I have a photograph here which I got out of the Courier Mail, and I'll pass it around, which was taken by, what is it, 1950? What did it say? 1950, and I'll pass it around, taken at 30,000 feet, which shows very clearly what it was like, certainly in 1950. And you'll see, if you look carefully, you can pick out Currumbin, the Tweed River, and the mountain range, and it's a significant feature. It's a whole Lamington sort of plateau area there. Okay, next one, thank you, Darryl. Rex Boyden, let's have a look at Rex. He was a World War I veteran, had served at Gallipoli as a machine gunner, I think it was, an infantry one. He was wounded on the famous Hill 60. You might remember that was one of the last battles, and that's where, what's his name, Throssell won his Victoria Cross. And he was wounded, he was evacuated out to the UK. He fell madly in love with, as it turned out to be, his second cousin, Marjorie. Sadly, she died about 18 months later of TB, so, he was in love. He decided to come back to Australia. Like a lot of those chaps, he wanted to go back and fight. He wanted to do something, and they wouldn't allow him to re-enlist in the army. So he went back, worked his own passage, worked a passage across to the UK, and joined the Royal Navy as a pilot. So that's where he began his flying career. Now, being a pilot in World War I was a pretty dangerous business. Not only did you often get shot down, but you didn't have a parachute, and there wasn't much future if you, ended up badly. He was a bit lucky because he flew for the Navy and he was doing patrols on the North Sea, which meant that he wasn't engaged in very much conflict with the Germans. He was watching the fleet. They were sending them out to make sure that the German fleet didn't sort of come out and cause havoc. That's him with his, a fairly short fellow, stocky, and apparently, according to all reports, an excellent pilot. Okay, next one, thank you. He joined Butler's Air Service, and what a lot of these fellows did. By the way, I should ask, what time? We've got a couple of hours for this talk, is that right, Dan? Yeah. Okay, give me a wind up if I start tapping your watches, and then I'll really know I'm in trouble. Like a lot of those World War I pilots, he loved flying and he wanted to keep flying, so they did barnstorming. They came back and they flew around and they did crazy things. My father first fell in love with flying because he was living in Wagga, and for his 12th birthday, his father very generously gave him I think it was £2 to do a circuit with Kingsford Smith. So, he talked about that. One of the reasons I grew up, hearing about flying is my dad flew with Kingsford Smith, But it was that sort of thing. They'd go out, people apparently would line up, like you'd get on a merry-go-round. You'd line up, pay your £2, and off you go and do a circuit, and then next. He did that, but then things were going pretty well in the north coast of New Guinea, gold. But the real problem was transport. How did you get in there? You couldn't go by road, shipping was slow. So, and the Germans were involved in that too. They started to use a lot of aircraft to bring in various pieces of equipment and passengers and so on. So he joined there and he flew a lot in New Guinea. Now I'm told New Guinea is probably the worst or the best place to learn how to fly. It's a pretty dangerous place to get your flying experience. It's rumoured that he was friends with Amy Johnson. Apparently friends was, a bit more than just friends. But he decided to come back to Australia, and when they got the Stinsons, he was very interested in flying one of the Stinsons. So he came back to Australia and joined the Airlines of Australia in March 1936. The photograph on the left-hand side is when he crashed in New Guinea. And there's something significant about this, because he landed it in a rainforest and he pancaked into the trees and he survived, but there was two differences between that and the Stinson. He was the only person on board and the aircraft was almost empty of fuel. There's no fuel. So he was landing and he was the only person on board the aircraft. You can see the aircraft there as a Junkers. It's sort of upended, but you can see it's pretty well intact, so he managed to scramble out of that. Uninjured is the report I heard. Okay, thanks. I've said that about where he crashed. He survived as the only occupant, however there was no fire. Okay, next one, thank you. Now Bev Shepherd was a young, wealthy North Shore boy from Sydney who loved flying, and apparently he was 25, single, and his father inherited some money and said he could have whatever he wanted, and he decided he wanted an aircraft, which you do if you live on the North Shore of Sydney and Dad offers you some money, then you go out and buy an aeroplane. And he got what they call a puss, or a puss moth, a predecessor to the tiger moth actually. He joined in 1936, so he had some experience. I think everyone's just seen, I just passed that around for general publication. As I said, he had a day off, but he was coaxed into flying. Now that's an unusual photograph because often the pilots didn't fly together. So there's a photograph of Bev Shepherd. Apparently the name Beverly was quite a common name for men during the 1930s and so on. He was known as B. George Merivale Shepherd. That's him on the left-hand side, and Rex Boyden on the right-hand side. Okay, next one. There were 5 passengers on board, and I will run through them because they're all interesting characters. On the left-hand side, sitting here, you had John Proud. Behind him, you had Westray, an English chap. I'll come to him. And here we have a really interesting Queenslander, or actually he was a Kiwi come Queenslander. Part of the White Shoe Brigade, let me tell you. Binstead, although he went under a different name. He went under Barnett. Over on the other side, you have William Fountain and James Graham. William Fountain was an American, and Graham I'll come to. Now, they all, for their own reasons, were desperate to get on that flight. And let's go to the next one. There were 2 crew. I've run through those. Let me just tell you a bit about each of them because it becomes relevant. John Proud was a mining engineer who had come down from New Guinea. He'd flown in from Townsville. He had malaria. He was as sick as a dog, and he was cranky because when he arrived at Archerfield, he found he had no ticket. He wasn't scheduled to go on board the aircraft. And apparently he stacked it on. He had a fight with the people at reception. He said, I demand, I'm John Proud, I demand to get on this aircraft. And apparently it got so heated that Boyd had to come over and say, look, calm down, all right, if he really wants to come, we'll put him on board. So that was John Proud. Now, Joe Binstead, he was a wool broker, but he was a bit of a naughty lad in a way because, this is my view, he almost arrived too late, came flying in the door and then said, no, I've got to get to Sydney, I have to go there. Now, how can I put this? He was found with a lot of money on him when he was one of the survivors. And he was taking money to put on the Randwick races in Sydney on the Saturday because he had already made a lot of money up here and apparently you had to pay tax on it. You wouldn't like that, would you? Avoiding tax, the magistrates would. So he used to take money and put it on the horse and say, oh, where did all your money come from? Oh, it was the 6th race, the grey mare, that's where it came from. And he was a runner for the what would I call them? The money launderers, the money launderers in Queensland. So he needed to get to the Randwick races for Saturday's afternoon races because that's where they cleaned the money up. Now, Westray's an interesting fellow, a young British chap who I think was a hero and became a hero. He loved cricket. He had come out to Australia with his new wife and she left him in Sydney. He had to come up to Brisbane. He was an insurance broker and he'd had to come up for a 1-day stint just to meet some people. But he wanted to go back because Bradman was batting the next day in Sydney and he wanted to get to the test. So, you think about it, an English fellow out in Australia, chance to see Bradman batting, sorry, you better get it right. Elocution. Say that 10 times in front of the grandkids and you might win something. So he was a cricket strategic. He just loved cricket. The whole reason he come out to Australia is he wanted to watch the English. And, very important, and we'll come back to this later, it was against the Poms, of course. So, and if those of you who were around in 1937, who remembers the 1937 Test Series? Oh, you were there, right? Yes, yes. Okay, let's go to the next fellow who's, whoa, what's we gone to the lovely Jane, but can you go back the other way? Okay. Down here we've got William Fountain, and he was an architect, and a very good architect, and he helped design some fairly prominent buildings around Brisbane, including, now this is before my time, the Metro Goldwyn Mayer Cinema. Does that ring any bells? And he had a name as an architect, but also it was his birthday on Saturday, and his family were waiting for him back in Sydney to celebrate his birthday. And he, actually one of the people who he'd visited sort of begged him not to go on that flight. He said, look, the weather's bad, don't go on that flight, wait until now. I said, no, I have to be back in Sydney because my wife is expecting me, 2 children, they were from New York, and I've got to be back in Sydney for my birthday. Now the last chap is a fellow by the name of Graham. Don't know a lot about him, but he manages a printing company. He'd come up for business. You had to be pretty well-heeled to fly, you know, you had to have some money to actually get on board. But he had a wife and 5 kids, and like a lot of us, I used to travel a lot. When you've done some work in another city, you just want to go home of a Friday afternoon. You don't want to be where you are. So, like, I've done my dog job. I want to get on the flight. I want to be home with my wife and kids in my own bed tonight. And so there you got it. So you got, now Boyd, the only pressure he had was he was under, you know, he was the chief pilot, under pressure to meet the schedule. You know, said we've got to be in Sydney by 5 o'clock or whatever it was. And of course, as I said, Bev had his own lustful reasons for wanting to go back to Sydney. Let's go to the next one. This is the lovely Jean Batten, I should call it Jean. Anyone know about her? She is a really well-known aviatrix. She's held world records. She's a Kiwi, and we should know a lot more about her. She's done some amazing things, and she was known as the Rita Garbo of the air. Pretty good-looking woman. I think I'd want to go back to Sydney that night if I had a date with her, before I met Carol, of course. Yeah. But that's her. And interestingly, I'll just jump ahead, when they mounted a search, she became a very dedicated pilot in trying to search for where the aircraft may have gone down. She was based in Sydney, and as far as I can read, she was quite distressed about the death of Bev Shepherd, and never married, and I'll come back to her life later. But I'm just surprised we don't know more about her. You've heard of her, haven't you? Yeah, she's, look her up.
You can find out about her if you're a Kiwi.
Oh, you know about her, do you?
I grew up in New Zealand.
Did you know about Jean Batten?
Yes, I did.
Did you know she was in love with Bev Shepherd?
No, I didn't know.
Okay.
Something they didn't tell us.
Well, actually, I'm surprised we haven't claimed Jean Batten as an Aussie. Don't we do that with any famous Kiwis? If they do something good, if they do something bad, they're a Kiwi. Right, let's go. Next one. The weather. Okay, this is the challenge. Now, over on the left-hand side, you'll see an old-fashioned newspaper weather pattern, and you'll see, quite unusual for February, you've got virtually a cyclonic condition here, just off the coast, about 120, 130 miles off the coast of the Tweed. Now, even in today's flying, if there's a cyclone brewing off the coast, you wouldn't even get in a jet airliner, you know, you wouldn't get in a big aircraft. That was the weather map. That's the weather map they were given for the takeoff. So there was enough reason to say, hey, the weather's pretty. They decided to ring Lismore. There was no radio communication. And the question was asked over the phone just before that, what's the weather like in Lismore? Now, I don't think they used these exact words, but it was something like, it's pissing down and rain. You know, you'll be lucky if you can land, because there was a grass strip. So they were told Lismore, Archerfield wasn't raining, but it was threatening weather. But that was the weather map. Anyway, they took off, and that's the route that he actually took, the red line. There was some suggestion just before he left that he might divert around the ranges and go down by the Tweed and then come into Lismore. The reason why he was keen to get to Lismore, there were 3 paying passengers who were due to get on board. Now, Boyd was a bit cranky about that because if you go back, Proud had forced his way onto the aircraft and there were only 2 seats. And Boyd was saying, well, and they passed a message through to the Lismore saying, well, only 2 of you are going to get on. So they were waiting out at the airfield to be picked up. But they also said we may or may not be able to land. You know, that was the way of things then. So they took off. Now, I'll jump ahead a little bit. Next one, let's have a look. They all had their reasons for going, and I've gone through that. That's 2 of the Stinsons on the strip at Archerfield. You've got the UHH and you've got the UGG, I think is the other one. Yeah, I've been through that. Let's go to the next one. All had their reasons. Westray, I've been through all of that. There's a book that I've got a copy of, which was written by Bruce MacDonald. Very well written. He's done a bit of what I've done. He's looked at the passengers, perhaps not in the same detail that I've gone to. Why did they... He's made it into a bit of a fictional sort of account, but it's quite readable and quite accurate. It's a good read. Have any of you read that? It was Fire on the Mountain. Right, let's go. Next one. What caused the crash? The riddle of the Stinson. Well, there's been probably one of the most interesting film versions of it was done by Channel 10, which you can now get a copy of up at O'Reilly's, which was a 3-part. And remember, O'Reilly was done by Jack Thompson, and I think who was the pilot. It was a fairly accurate, mostly, but some of the end bits are not quite right about how the rescue occurred, but we'll come back to that. If you want to have a look at it, you can get it. I do have a copy, a video copy of a DVD copy of it. What caused the crash? The next one. Right. There's no doubt that the weather was a significant factor, not necessarily the woman, but there was weather that was threatening and should have been, considered. But Boyd was an experienced pilot, and I think he sort of felt, look, I've done this many times, I've got to keep to a schedule, I've got all these people carrying on, Proud had put up a fight and said, I've got to get back to Sydney. He was a prominent businessman. They had no radio communications. There were no radios in the aircraft and no radio station. And in fact, there was no communication between what we now know as O'Reilly's. There was no telephone or anything, so no one could ring and say, what's the weather like over the mountains? Now, just might get you to go back one more, if you can. Well, another one. One more. Sorry, I thought I was a bit closer. Not a very good, because it's not very large. When you fly, and there's often an updraft on one side, and the wind was coming through at apparently about 120 miles per hour, which was a very strong wind, is the downdraft and the updraft can make a lot of difference. So what he was flying in from the north, coming to the last ledge or last cliff, and he flew at it, but as he came up, there was a downdraft that came over the top. So he was apparently flying high enough, but when he started to go, there was a downdraft that pushed the aircraft down. Now, this came out of the coroner's report, and I believe is, apart from my friend over here, is probably quite right, that if you're coming in and the wind's coming the other way, the downdraft will push your aircraft down. Remember, it only had a limited ceiling too. So he was flying into what he knew was a height that he had to exceed. Now, just to comment about flying, and this is one of the basic things that I know, when you fly, you've always got in your back of your mind, what happens if the engine's cut out? What do I do if I can't fly or I'm about to crash? And often, even in 747s, I've spoken to a few pilots, they know when they're flying from, or they used to fly from, say, Los Angeles to Australia, they'd know, look, there's a safe landing spot at Hawaii or Fiji. They'll always have, the X factor, what happens if we have a problem? The same with pilots here. What happens if something goes wrong? Now, I believe Boyd knew that if he got over the top there, he would be okay, because it was flat downhill run to Lismore. But the big obstacle was getting over the big problem. The other thing, now here I'm making an assumption, this is what my instructor told me when I was flying, if you don't have a safe spot in front of you, do a U-turn, go back to where you came from, because at least you know what was back behind you. And he had flown over a couple of areas where there was some areas where he may have been able to safely land or even gone back to Archerfield. So I think what happened was Boyd was sort of pushing himself, and thought, right, if we can get over this last hump, we're home and hosed, we can get down to Lismore. So let's go a few slides further ahead. Keep going. Oh, sorry, back to that one here. The pilot really had the sole discretion as to whether they flew, so there was no air traffic control person saying, hey, the weather's too bad, you can't fly today. They said, well, I'm going to fly, and it's my aircraft, my job, you know, I can do what I want to. The downdraft caused a significant loss of height. There seemed to be some discussion from the survivors that the altimeter, is it the altimeter? The height was, they were tapping it, and it seemed like it may not have been properly calibrated. And just at the crash site, one of the passengers saw Bev Shepherd leaning over and tapping one of the instruments, which they thought might have been, hang on, what height are we? We're not sure. So there may have been an error in the instrument. They had 3 engines, and if you get into a very cold wind situation like that, they can ice up. Now, there is a procedure for de-icing, but it takes a little bit of time. You have to change the mixture. I don't know what you do, but you actually can deal with it, but it's not an instantaneous thing. And it seems as if there was a loss of power that the passengers who survived talked about. There seemed to be a loss of power, and they were in a very mountainous area. Okay, next one. Now, it hit into the side, and it looked like it banked to the, let me get this right, it banked to the port side, which meant that it came down, and it was the starboard side that really hit the tree and smashed into this very large tree. Both the pilots were believed to have been killed instantaneously. The damage was mostly done to the starboard side, so the port side was relatively undamaged. Halfway down, well, when it was fouled, about halfway down, about 200 or 300 metres down the side of the ridge, so they'd almost got there. You know, it wasn't too much further to get over the top. And the passengers on the left-hand side didn't have a door to get out, so this is where the door also became important. And apparently Binstead was a big fat fellow, and he got stuck in one of the windows that popped open. They could smell fuel, and they could smell that there was a fire starting. We don't know whether the 2 passengers on the other side, that's Fountain and Graham, whether they were alive or not. There was some suggestion that they heard them screaming when the fire took hold. Binstead got caught, and apparently Proud gave him a good kick up the arse to get out of the way so they could get out of the aircraft. Westray had suffered. He was actually trying to help some of the passengers, and he got quite badly burnt. He got burnt on the buttocks and on his hands, which became a little bit relevant to later on. They managed to get out. Okay, let's go to the next one. How are we going for time? 10, okay. I think I'm right. Despite a number of sightings, the search ranged from Brisbane to Sydney, and there was even a search off Bondi Beach. You know, the plane had been seen off Bondi coming into, you know, Botany Bay where the airfield was. Coffs Harbour, a police sergeant swore on oath that he saw the Stinson, you know, coming over the coast. So they didn't actually know which route he'd taken. They didn't know whether he came down the coast, went inland, or went on the route that he subsequently did take. There were very few searches over the Lamington because the weather was still bad and there wasn't much evidence of any damage. You know, very little you could see if there's cloud, and you know the aircraft are trying to peer out. So there wasn't a lot of success in searching in the area that was ultimately found. Okay, next one. It crashed mid-afternoon. Westray was the least injured. Proud had broken a leg. Binstead wasn't a very fit man, although, you know, he had the good life. He basically survived, and then they started saying, well, what do we do next? Westray was very fit. He'd done a lot of walking in the UK. And even though he was a bit hurt, he had burns to his buttocks and his hands, he said, I thought I saw a homestead down the creek. And he decided within a couple of hours to take off and go down the creek towards what we now know is where Westray's grave is, and I think it's Christmas Creek is down that. Christmas Creek, I think, was the homestead he was looking for. Right, that was on the Friday. They think he probably died on the Saturday, and that was discovered by Bernard, and probably the rest of the story you know fairly well, so I can go over it fairly quickly. They were there for almost over a week, from the Friday to the Sunday. When Bernard found them, there was only Proud and Binstead left. Westray had taken off. When O'Reilly got there, he only found Proud and Binstead there, and apparently they're on their last legs, literally. Binstead is a bit of a hero because he had a flask, I think it belonged to Boyd, and he was scrambling down to get water, and he was bringing it up to stuff. Well, they had very little food, had almost none, they were eating some berries, but he was bringing the water up to Proud. So you can survive on water for a lot longer than you can, obviously, without food. And he said to him on this day, I can't do it anymore. You know, I've scrambled down, scrambled back, I just can't bring, you know, I haven't got the energy. They had decided that they would shout out the famous cooey every hour. So, you know, 9 days later, they were still calling out every hour, cooey, 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 which became important for Bernard, of course. Let's just move on. Let's talk a little bit about Bernard, who, a remarkable man. I met someone a few years ago who knew him quite well. Anyone meet Bernard or his family? You knew him, did you? Or knew?
I knew Peter.
Okay, that's the son, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, he's still up there, isn't he? He cooks the toast, doesn't he? But apparently he was an amazing man. I've read his full story on the account. You do get it in Green Mountains, and you know, it's quite a good story. He regards it as they moved up there. They came from the Blue Mountains, so he grew up in the bush. He went to Gregory Terrace. He worked on the dairy farm, and they started to develop a pretty good little business with guests going up there. It was a pretty rough ride, but you'd go up and experience the guest house at O'Reilly's, which is still very much a pleasure for anyone who wants a few days in the rainforest. He believed he knew where it was. And if you look at that Channel 10, he got a map and a ruler and drew a line, and he said, if it went over Widgie, I know where it's gone. It's gone a straight line to Lismore. That's where I'm going to go for a search. So he took off. Next one. That's just an aerial view. Now, I'll pass the map around on that. But this is O'Reilly's guest house. That's the main track. Have any of you done the border range tracks around it? Yeah. Well, you make a left-hand turn there, and you go down to Binnaburra. But if you take a right-hand turn, and it's not really a track anymore, you go along here. Now, I'll jump ahead. He got to this point. He'd gone on Saturday, left early on Saturday morning. He slept overnight, rough, that night, and then he got up early in the morning, stood on a ridge there and looked over and saw a tree that had been burnt. Because he was such a good bushman, he knew that that was an unnatural leaf burning. And he had enough bushcraft to go virtually, because he didn't want to lose his direction. He describes this, he had to go in a straight line. He knew where it was, so he didn't go the easiest way. He went up and down. A really remarkable feat. And he came and he found the two survivors who were there. I have enormous admiration for him. I think what he did, he regards it too as a bit of a spiritual experience. He thinks, you know, God opened up the clouds so he could see where to go. He heard the cooee quite some time before he answered, because he thought there might have been other search parties around. So he didn't answer, and it wasn't until he was about 30 metres away from them he saw them, and he was quite shocked and ultimately traumatised, because there were still bodies there as well. There were other. He found them, and they were in a very bad state. They wouldn't have lasted more than another 24 hours. Okay, I see Dean's watching his watch, so I better move on. Won't talk much about him. The only thing I found really curious is what he decided to take with him. If someone said, you're going to go out and rescue a few people who might have crashed, I'd get my first aid kit and, you know, I'd get all that. He decided to take a billy, some bread, onions, and a bit of sugar and some tea. And he didn't even take wet weather gear. He had a cardigan, you know, sort of a woolly jumper. He was a tough fellow. He went on his horse as far as it'd go, then jumped off, and off he went. I don't know why he took onions. You know, he had a whole bag of onions, but anyway, that's what you do when you're going out looking for the Stinson. He'd stood on a nail 2 days beforehand, and he had an infected foot. And his wife was saying, "Bernard, what are you doing?" And he's saying, "Don't you worry about this, darling. You know, I'm off. You know, I'm going to find this error. I know where it is." Apparently, he was very, very determined, very committed. And that's him there after the rescue. A brilliant man. Sadly, he went off to World War II and was part of the siege of Tobruk and became quite a hero. But he became fairly traumatised by that. And sadly, I think there was a bit of alcohol that sort of occurred in his life, and you know. But also the trauma of him finding those bodies, but also the two people. You're a very humble man. Apparently, he didn't make a lot of it, didn't sort of say too much. Okay, next one. Sees this bird tree 6 miles away, and let's go across to the next one. Apparently, okay, this is a question. When he arrived at the scene, what was the first question that, it was Proud, I think, who put it to him. What was the first question they asked Bernard O'Reilly? What's the cricket score? Which I think is pretty amazing. You know, you've been out in the bush for 10 days. Okay, you got any water? You got any? No, what's the cricket score? True dedication to a cause. That's a photograph that was taken of the survivors. There is a monument in O'Reilly's, which annoys me a little bit for historical accuracy. And it's a good sculpture, don't get me wrong. It shows Bernard O'Reilly offering water to the two survivors, Proud and Binstead. What's wrong with that statue? Well, the sculpture. He didn't have a mug, he had a billy. He's got a bushman's mug there. He didn't have I sort of think, why can't you get things right? You know, why can't you just do it the way it happened? Because we all know he had a billy. It's just a tin can with a bit of wire off the top of it. Anyway, he saved them. He then took off. Let's go quickly. He then took off down the hill. He decided to follow Westray's track, and he was such a good bushman he could see where Westray had gone. I'll make it short. He found that Westray had almost reached the bottom, but he'd fallen, slipped. He grabbed hold of some vines, which in England would have held him. In Australia, I forget the name of the vine now. It slipped. He fell, broke his ankle. When he came up to him, he was sitting with a half-used cigarette in his hand with his foot in some cold water, which is what you do if you break a limb or sprain an ankle. And he thought he might have even been alive, but when he touched him, sadly, he found that the crows had actually got him, so it was quite a bit of a shock. He then took off on this mad plunge down all the way to Christmas Creek, raised the alarm. They developed a stretcher track, which was up from the Bow Desert Way. And I'm sure most of you know this bit. He became a hero. Let's move on quickly. They extracted the bodies. They actually buried them up there. That's Binstead, and that's them being carried out. It was an enormous effort. The whole community got together and cut the track up, which they call the stretcher track from Bow Desert. And of course, it was big news. It went right around the country and indeed the world. Next one. National media, 5 die in air crash. They've got the photos of the Stinson. Westray's grave, have any of you been to that? It's a lovely spot, isn't it? It's in the trees there. And apparently his family came out with the intention of exhuming his body and taking it back to England. When they saw where it was and how it had been looked after, they said, no, leave it where it is. That's the place for him to be remembered. It's not too hard a walk to get to it, actually. No, you have to go do a bit of creek bashing.
It's a lot easier now.
Have you been to the Stinson, have you?
Yeah, several times.
Oh, you should be giving this talk.
We come up from Christmas Creek.
You did go up the Christmas Creek way. I believe that, in a way, is a lot easier. I haven't done it. I believe you can scramble up and it's a lot easier than going around. Did you pitch any of the stuff out of the Stinson? No.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
The last time we did was only a couple of months ago.
Oh, okay.
And they've had to rebuild a lot of it because of the huge storm that smashed it all up. So somebody's
Just tell us a little bit more about it.
Oh, no.
All right, okay. We'll get you in a
It's just a
minute.
huge storm and trees came
Yeah.
out and wiped out a bit more of the monument and that, but it's all been rebuilt.
Oh, okay. Well, someone took the plaques off the graves there, and they've had a bit of trouble with vandalism. And I gave a talk at O'Reilly's, and a fellow turned up there with a part of the Stinson wheels. And he said, what do I do with this? And I said, well, give it to the museum, or what? There's a museum in Bow Desert too, I think, where they've got a few under, but that, is it still like that? Is that what it's...
Slightly different, that's the old one.
Okay. All right, let's finish off with a bit of a roundup. Just go back to the other one. What came out of that was they improved the weather reporting. They got a telephone connection to O'Reilly's. They insisted within the next 18 months that every aircraft doing commercial flights was radio installed, contact, even though that meant that sometimes you were out of radio contact. The aviation used to be controlled by the Defence Forces, or the Defence. They decided, no, civil aviation will approve and will monitor flight plans from that time onwards. So there are a few good things that came out of that. Next one. The Stinsons were interesting because there were 4 of them. They were regarded... 3 of them came to pretty sad endings. They were converted to 2 engines during World War II, or the 2 remaining ones. One crashed about 6 weeks later at Archerfield. It had a Chinese businessman on board, and it was crashed on takeoff, believed to be a lack of fuel, which you have to ask a few questions about what went on the ground when the aircraft was being prepared. The city of Grafton flew again. They put 2 engines on it and used them as military transports during the war, which was probably a better thing, but then one took off in January 1945, and they believe it was because of the struts, the poor struts at the top rather than the bottom, and a wing fell off, and of course everyone died. That was out of Essendon. They decided that the city of Townsville would no longer be certified, so it was scrapped. Right, I think we're in the end. O'Reilly, Proud and Binstead. Well, Proud and Binstead didn't really get on after that, you'd think so, but I think they were too different. Proud was and I asked someone before, he became the head of a very significant mining magnate. He called his firm Pico Wallsend. He probably got shares in it. What does the Pico stand for? Wallsend is a mine near Newcastle. What's the Pico? His dog. So there you go. If you're going to register a company, you name it after your dog. So there you go. You've got a bit of trivia for next time. They did get together. Binstead decided he'd never fly again. Proud did pretty well. He went on. Apparently they, respected each other. I think Binstead saved his life. And I think Westray behaved very bravely too. He gave it a go, even though, you think about it, he was a POM. He'd never been in the Australian bush. He'd never lay in the middle of a rainforest. And he takes off and he does his best to try and, get help. So there are 2 heroes, in my opinion. Binstead, even though apparently he was very coy about the money he had on him. He didn't really need anyone to be going through his wallet or anything. So, we've all know about what's happened up at O'Reilly's. It's a lovely place to go to. He died in a repat hospital. More than a hero. That's down at Bow Desert. And I think, let's go quickly. Yep. That's the plaque that I think is still there, is it? That's, yeah. Look, I do acknowledge I've not been to the site, so that I would love to, and I'm probably still planning, but I think if you're going to do it from O'Reilly's, you've got to be pretty fit. And I think you either do it in one day, or you do it overnight and stop somewhere along the way. Okay, I thank you for letting me speak, and I think we ran over time a bit. Apologies.